Hello, everyone. Welcome to another Bounty episode of the Day Zero podcast. I'm Spectre, with me is Z. In this episode, we have a path traversal in elFinder, an auth bypass, which is a little bit mysterious, a GitLab arbitrary file read, and a PHP filter var bug. So we'll start off first with the Synactive post about elFinder or elFinder, a web-based file manager, and a path traversal bug that they found there. Post is a little weird, not gonna lie. It goes into a little bit of a story on how they stumbled on the software and engagement and some of the history on elFinder, which we'll mostly skip here just to get to the issue.
Well, Skip,
Um,
I do want to comment. I didn't like with the fact that they kind of led this post. Like, you've got the situation, and they end that with the fact is our target, if not good with software updates, has top notch server hardening, no write permissions in webroot, disabled PHP handler, minimum deployment, and all of that. Like, I was expecting them to kind of dive into dealing with any of those, and they don't. They just there's a path traversal, and you need these other preconditions, and don't even talk about much on how they deal with it. So I felt a little bit like it was like a bait and switch almost. I was expecting a little bit more from this one.
Teased
Thank
you a little
you,
bit.
Imperial G, for the Prime sub.
Yeah, so that's kind of what I was thinking too, was there was a lot in the top end of the post which they kind of mention, but it isn't like relevant for the issue really. So yeah, you can kind of skip the first half of the post when you're reading through. Anyway, getting into the root issue, elFinder has a connector endpoint which allows you to specify a command and parameters to that command. One of those commands is file for reading file content, which will take a target. And they tried using a directory traversal string to read etc password, and it ended up working, which they weren't expecting. They call out that elFinder has been pretty well audited, and like Z just talked about with the server hardening. So it seems like the elFinder developers have security in mind there, but this is just one that slipped through the cracks. Um, where it gets a bit funny is when it comes to why the path traversal exists, because they found that this get full path function eventually gets called for resolving the file path that gets passed in here, um, and it can be used in different cases, including like for when you have a base path, and it has code to attempt to normalize the like the directory your typical directory traversal operator, the dot dot slash operator out of strings, and it uses regular expressions to do that. But the regular expression has an edge case that it can't seem to catch because it tries to account for a base path being present. They'll check for a slash, then some non-slash characters, then the slash dot dot slash. So if you just pass a slash dot dot slash, that kind of bypasses the regular expression and doesn't get caught. Um, so it just seems kind of a little bit weird with how they were trying to use the regular expression, and it just wasn't thoroughly tested, I guess. Um, at the
Really,
time they
it's
discovered this, oh, go ahead.
I was just going to say, it's really like a code smell when you even see them trying to do this in the first place. Um, and yeah, IABR and Chav mentioned spoiler alert for Spot the Vault. Yes, this is where I got the code for this week's Spot the Vault, or at least based on it.
Yeah, it's
Um,
stolen.
yeah, I do that for some of them. It's nice to use, I guess, relevant code. But anyway, on this one, like, the regex, like, it kind of makes sense because what they're doing effectively is matching the directory before the dot dot slash and the dot dot slash and just removing both of them. So it effectively performs the dot dot slash using text editing instead of actually letting the operating system try and resolve it. And that's kind of always the warning sign with these things, I think, is when you see them trying to do this sort of normalization, which really just shouldn't even be happening in this code. Um, the ideal case, I usually say, resolve, just take whatever path they give you, resolve it to the actual file, um, and then let the operating system resolve to an actual file path, like the canonical path, and then check the base of that is usually going to be a more secure way of actually doing it. That way everything's getting normalized, you know exactly what path it's looking for, or it's going to use, and then you just look at that start in order to figure out if it's what you're expecting or not. By trying to do it here, it's like they're aware of the security, but this isn't. It's the wrong layer to be performing this check, in my opinion. So it's definitely one of those code smells whenever I see this sort of normalization happening.
So that kind of nicely segues into the second part of this post, where the way they exploited this bug at the time when they discovered it on the engagement was like this could just be directly exploited to read the etc shadow file using like a relative path and yeah, just having a path traversal payload. They wanted to check if this issue still existed and was exploitable in latest versions, because they said there was about 50 minor versions released since they found this bug originally. Um, and they discovered that while the bug still technically existed, the exploit payload failed because earlier in the call chain, when the target is decoded, if the path is relative, it'll call this join path function, sorry, which will resolve the real path. So that dot dot slash operator never really makes it to that get full path function. So because they were doing that path resolution, they were kind of protected from that pathing. Absolute paths were still a viable option, though they found, and while there was some checking with parsing of absolute paths to try to ensure the path was the root or inside of the root, um, because it ultimately used get file path, it was still vulnerable to directory traversal, so they were able to go up and outside of that root directory. Um, so they were then again able to get etc password read out by just specifying the root path prefix and appending the payload onto that. So that is a bit of a stipulation. For the second way they exploited it, you would have to know the root file path in some way. You would have to like leak it or guess it or whatever. But assuming you can exploit this path traversal for basically an arbitrary file read. Um,
Yeah, and this I feel like years ago this used to be more of a concern, but these days with everybody using Docker and containers, like they're able like to just toss things into rather standardized paths that like var ww HTML or just var ww sometimes. Like there are these standard paths you can try that are pretty likely
they're
to
pretty
work,
guessable.
especially when people are using these containers and not needing to like have multiple apps sharing all on one. I mean, they might be sharing the same server, but they're in their own little isolated space. At least they're somewhat isolated. And yeah, Belika mentioned old is new again. Like, yeah, it's not a crazy vulnerability. I thought it was interesting just in the fact they were clearly aware of it, and their regex. I don't see it that often where people are. What I've seen more often is actually trying to strip just the dot dot slash, just matching dot dot slash, and get rid of it. Rather than trying to do this like match the directory and the dot dot slash and actually performing the traversal in a sense. I haven't really seen that too often.
It, it
No case comes to mind actually where I've seen that before.
it feels like it tries to do too much, and that's like what caused the issue.
Yeah, well,
Um,
even removing dot dot slash like it still feels like a bad move there. Um,
but it would have worked here.
it would have potentially worked here. Yeah. I mean, there are perhaps depending on how they do the dot dot slash, there are other sort of filter bypass that can be done. Thus, I feel it's best to let the system resolve it. Oh, but yeah, I mean, it was a little bit weird in that sense, and then the bypass just. I actually do want to jump back up on the regex here. So the core issue with this regex, um, you'll notice on screen, sorry for those of you just listening, but it starts off by trying to match the directory separator. Um, and then it matches any non-character. So that's where it's specifically looking for basically actually the real issue here is this plus sign. Had they used the star saying this is basically optional 0 or more instances of a non-slash, this would have worked. But because they're asking for 1 or more because of the plus sign of the non slash characters, that's basically where it breaks. It slash slash won't match on it. Which I mean isn't a uncommon to see uh traversal bypass. But still, like I mentioned, this case is just a little bit interesting to me because of what they're trying to do. Like they're trying to do, I guess, a sane traversal. They just shouldn't be doing it in the first place.
Something else I I was thinking about when I was reading this code was we always like to speculate on like the discoverability and how it might have been missed if this code was reviewed, like assuming that somebody reviewed this code. Um, and I feel like if I was kind of in the shoes of somebody that was reviewing this, when you see this regex expression, it can be easy to kind of go, okay, there's checking going on here, there's regular expression, and just not um like test that regular expression. And especially for someone like me who's not like, I don't know regex super well, I'm not gonna lie. Like I'm not I have to use a tester tool whenever I'm trying to write a regular expression and kind of fumble with it. I'm not fluent with it. So this could be like really easy to miss if you're just quickly glancing over it and like notice the regular expression check is there but not actually look at the expression itself too much. So
At a pure
it kind of
code
makes
review,
sense,
yeah,
and you can kind of give a bit of uh, I guess, a bit of devil's advocate for why this issue was in there for so long.
it's
Go
definitely
ahead,
one
Z.
of those things that it's a lot easier to find with dynamic testing rather than reading the code. Like, even if I were doing a code review on this, like, as I've said, one of those things that gets my suspicions up is seeing this sort of normalization at all. So I would be copying and pasting this code and just trying a few test cases against it. Um, and I'm sure I'm not the only code reviewer who actually still runs some code when I'm doing code reviews, especially when it's a little bit opaque like that. Um, but yeah, this is something that definitely would have been easier. And in fact, the Synactive team did find it through dynamic testing and then dug into why it happened rather than from the code review aspect.
All right, so up next we have an auth bypass and an undisclosed target posted by Islam Akil, which deals with tampering with a JSON login request. Now, unfortunately, we don't really have background details of the specifics of this bug and why it happens, like we did with this inactive post. It seems to be one of those cases where they just played around with the request data and eventually found something that would do something interesting. Though, Z, you have a bit of a theory, so I'll let you cover this one here.
A little bit of a theory. So the core issue, ultimately you'll see the login request here. I assume they don't actually show us the URL for it, but I assume it's going to something like /login, and it just has this JSON bit with the email and the password as the two keys of the root, like JSON dictionary. Uh, Kind of makes sense. I'm sure we probably all seen similar requests before. All they did to bypass this was change that to have, instead of a password and email being in the kind of root of the, and I hate that they chose to use also the word root here, but basically they created another field inside of the JSON. Well, they created a field inside of the JSON. They named it root, and then made the password and email as the object belonging to that field. So now the password and email fields are actually part of a sub object of the or in the JSON tree. And that apparently worked to get them logged in as the root user. They're not explicit on whether or not you can access other accounts. They're like, gets you logged in as the root user. Because it will contain data related to root. But then it's you find yourself logged in as an admin. So they're kind of a little bit inconsistent on the phrasing. So I'm not sure if this would also work if you say like another username, like admin or something. That's kind of my theory though, is seeing something like this. It's a test case, but I don't see an immediate reason why it would work, why just changing that would work, unless what I think is happening here is the case of something's taking in, it's kind of expecting just random objects to come into the query. So it's going to be like find the user, and then you give it kind of like a NoSQL lookup. You give it this object with all of your constraints for it, and then it tries to match it. And so when you give it a constraint like this, where it doesn't have like the password or email that's expecting, it's just got this object, it's probably resolving it down into some other lookup that either leads to the first user being brought back or something like actually finding that username. So kind of similar in a sense to something I talked about when we covered the MySQL JS injection when Maxwell Dulin found an auth bypass on his own website. It feels like it could be something like that, so that's kind of why I still want to call this out, even though we don't know for sure. It's an interesting test case to keep in mind because there are those cases of applications that will try and be a little bit smarter than you expect, and honestly, just the NoSQL injection aspect. If it is just taking an object, there perhaps could have been more of a SQL injection to this, depending on what they provided. If it's just going from user input to some sort of query generator that sits between it and hopefully a prepared query. Um, there could be some room there. We don't know for sure, but I still thought it was worth at least pointing this one out because it is definitely an interesting case. I would love to know a little bit more about the details on that. But all we really get is it worked, and it worked for a mysterious reason.
Yeah, and to be fair, like that's the situation you just get placed in sometimes as a researcher. Like if you're researching a target that you don't have the source code to, and you just try something and it works, uh, you just kind of have to be happy with that. You're not really going to know exactly why, and yeah, in this case, the researcher might not know because it could be a closed source target. We don't know because all of that information has been censored out as an undisclosed target, but that's what I suspect is happening here. It's just they tried it, it worked, and that was good enough. And
Oh, yeah, that's definitely what they did. I mean, their end notes here are basically before giving up, try and change the array name to admin root user admitted, like trying basically those usernames. It's just like try this as a test case because it worked for me. So yeah, that's clearly what happened here, and that's fair. That I mean, oftentimes with testing, you're just tossing things to see if something happens that you don't expect, and then you dig into it more to figure out how you might be able to exploit it. Or I mean, in this case, it was exploitable pretty much on its own. But I
yeah.
mean, that is part of testing. You just look for responses that don't quite match your intuition or your expectations.
All right, so getting into a HackerOne report, we have an arbitrary file read vuln in GitLab's uploads pipeline for group uploads. This was reported by Vax to their H1. The problem occurs when the pipeline tries to extract the tarball that's attached using untar ZXF, because untar ZXF will extract the symlinks or the symbolic links as is. So whenever a file is loaded, when viewing it later on, that symlink can be followed to read whatever file is linked to on the file system, such as the secrets YAML file, for example. So pretty quick issue to get through here. It's kind of that classic symbolic links inside of tarballs and see what happens when it gets extracted. In this case, they're not stripped or ignored at all. So because the symlinks are preserved, an attacker can abuse that. So
Yeah, it's
yeah,
basically
one of the quickest GitLab issues we've ever covered.
it's once it's extracted to the like actual file. When you go to view the file because it's pointing to a symlink, it'll resolve that when you go to actually view it, giving you the arbitrary file read. I do think it's interesting here. One, that it's so simple. Like you said, it's one of the simplest GitLab issues we've covered. And part of that, I think, is just because of the fact. Actually, we have covered a similarly simple issue, and that was like with the default branch name XSS. Um,
Oh yeah,
where
you're right. I forgot about
yeah, it
that.
was a really simple XSS, just setting default branch name, and in one page it gets echoed without any sanitization. That was similarly easy, and I think it had, I'm not going to say a similar root cause, but similar reasoning as to why it still existed. Mostly being it's a little bit obscure that the functionality is like there, like you don't see that page, the default branch name, like you didn't see that particular page very often unless you also had like an empty repo. So like it wasn't the commonly exercised functionality. In this case, this is part of a group import. So you set up your GitLab instance and you want to import like an already existing group. Then you do that, and any attachments in there, it's going to pull down this uploads.tar.gz file. So it's not necessarily clear that it's even doing that or how the uploads work. So like it's a little bit opaque, and I think that's why it could be looked over. It's just not the most common functionality, thus it's not getting exercised as much. And this did get a $29,000 bounty. I don't think you mentioned that.
No, I
So,
didn't.
very
So
nice
yes,
bounty for it.
yeah, nice payout for the researcher for sure. All right, so we'll get into our last topic here, which is a bug in filter var for PHP. It's a little bit interesting because it's technically a binary level issue, being a signedness bug, but it has implications on the web side of things, so that's why we're covering it today and not tomorrow. Uh, I'll let you take this one away.
Yeah, it's a fun issue. Practicality of actually exploiting this is a little bit questionable. And it just comes down to, if you're not super familiar on the binary side, signed versus unsigned integers. Unsigned integers being basically they'll only be positive from 0 up to whatever the maximum binary number it can store. With signed, there's this thing called two's complement. It stores the number in a fancy way that basically a really really big number where that very first, like the most significant bit, or just a really big number, can be negative. It comes down to an issue with that where it passes a unsigned value, the size of a string. Sizes are often stored as like this size t, which is an unsigned value, and it ends up using that unsigned value and passes it into a somewhere that's expecting it to be signed, where it uses an integer, signed integer. And so when it does this iteration over, so for filter var, you basically give it whatever string variable you want. And you give it the flag saying like you want to filter, like validate domain, validate or filter flag host name. Um, Give it the flags, basically saying what you want it to filter, what you want to look for and do. So in this case, it's basically saying like make sure this is a real like looking domain, filter it like that. And because that length, when it goes to the integer, becomes negative if you give it something sufficiently long, the actual loop, which is going like from 0 to end type of deal, because 0 is already or because 0 is already greater than any negative number, the end value, it's just not going to do the iteration. It's not actually going to check. There are a couple other constraints on some other checks going on there I won't dive into, but the gist of it really is just sending a insanely long string will bypass the entire filter check, at least for these filters. This isn't true for all of them. So I thought it was interesting to call out that one, this even happened. And they do have the sample code of this being like checking a filter, validate domain, and host name before using it in a system command. So kind of the worst case scenario. It's a fun thing, just sending a very long string. The realistic attack on this, because that is user input, so the size of this on like a 32-bit server is going to have to be like 4 gigabytes, so a 4 gigabyte long string being passed in somewhere. A lot of servers are not going to let you do that. So the likelihood of running into this in a lot of cases is pretty low. Um, but it's still an interesting issue that does exist, and it does seem like PHP didn't really want to patch this either. They said they basically just attached. They've got their own patch for it, but the PHP security team didn't want to, or has not yet patched this, and they weren't
Yeah, I
getting any
remember.
response.
I remember seeing this on Twitter that yeah, they were like they're not responding to me, so yeah, I'll just post about it in like a couple hours, and then it landed. So
Yeah,
um
it's a fun issue. I kind of get why they're not super worried about it. A 4 gigabyte anything, like PHP's default is, I don't recall the exact value, but like a request size and a lot of these things can't be more than like a couple megabytes to start. And then if you've got any reverse proxy in there, that's probably not going to like a 4 gigabyte request coming in, especially if it's not to an endpoint like a file upload endpoint or something. There's definitely some restrictions on actually using this, but it's there and just worth being aware of if you're in that very probably rare scenario.
that said, even though it might not be practical to exploit in most cases, this is such an easy fix. So it's kind of
That too, yeah. Yeah,
seems
like
kind of insane to me that they wouldn't take like a couple seconds to fix this issue. But you know, who knows? PHP seems weird. I feel like we've covered quite a few issues in the past where it's been an issue that was in PHP that took years to fix or just wasn't fixed at the time we covered it.
yeah, we've covered a few.
PHP and security, they don't seem to take it like super seriously for whatever reason.
Part of it comes down like so some of the issues we've covered before have been things where it's somebody who's able to execute PHP code. So like your attack surface is like the attacker's already pretty privileged to be able to do that. And then in most cases if you can run PHP code, you can already do everything. So the fact that you can exploit the PHP engine doesn't matter. The only time it really matters is on like shared hosts where they'll use PHP safe mode and then you can bypass safe mode using some of the exploits. And so not the most common way of doing secure. I mean, it's still absolutely used. There are a ton of shared hosts out there using it. So like it's there. Most deployments, like random application deployed on it. Well, I guess I'm saying that, but you know what? PHP is insanely popular with like WordPress and stuff going to be on a shared host. So yeah, most deployments probably are even using that. Um, so I'll backtrack on that statement. Most like corporations running a PHP application are probably not using a shared host. They're more isolated, and so it doesn't even matter. And so that's why PHP in the past is, chosen not to fix certain things because it already requires that high level of access. That said, this one really is just like, I mean, the patch is basically changing that int to a size t being unsigned and the int being um a signed variable. So changing that fixes the bug or effectively fixes it. So I mean, it's an easy patch. I agree with you. It's not a great look for PHP. PHP isn't a great look ever, really, honestly.
Man, yeah, it's been a while since we've had to dig at PHP a little bit, so I guess I did want to call out there was a bonus issue in here as well. I won't go too deep into it because, again, this is going a little bit more into the binary side of things. But because you could like exceed int max in size and wrap it back around to zero, there was a potential out of bound, like heavily restricted out of bounds write that could occur here too. Um, and the reason I say heavily restricted is it would only write like a dot character and it would write it, you know, super far out of bounds. So probably not really exploitable realistically, but it is there. So if you're interested in that bonus bug, that's about halfway through, I think, when they talk about that. So
So that I think was this code, right? Um
yeah, there you go.
so I mean,
I
is
don't know
that
exactly what the code is doing here with like a trailing dot, but
I was
yeah,
going to say
whatever
it's
normalization they were trying to do here was where that primitive opened up.
it's dereferencing T to get the dot and then it's assigning the E pointer. So I mean, it's not writing a dot, it's writing the pointer potentially out of bounds. I would want to look more at the context there. I remembered I'm saying that. I just didn't really look at it too much. I figured
Yeah,
the interesting issue here is the filter var, not the binary one.
for sure.
Um,
Like this one's even less practical and into the area of probably not exploitable. But
I don't know. Maybe we'll have to
um,
discuss it tomorrow. But actually, because that's possibly writing a pointer out of bounds, that actually seems a little bit more interesting than just if it were writing a dot. Because it
so
looks like it's saying E equals
down
T. So maybe we'll
so
want to
down
discuss
below
this
they do
tomorrow. Sorry, go ahead.
down below they do say like it will write a dot out of bounds. So that's kind of where I was taking that from was I was thinking they had a bit more context than what I was looking at in the code here and because yeah, I was a little bit confused too. I thought it would be writing a pointer as well, but they say that it just writes a literal dot character. So yeah,
Fair
I'm
enough.
not
Yeah,
sure.
I didn't look the code anywhere near enough to figure that out. And they do have more context, so we can go with what they're saying too. But scrolling up for it, I did notice that.
Yeah. Oh, I think maybe if we look a little bit further down, it makes sense because they check if like that pointer value is equal to sorry, when they dereference it, they check if it's equal like to the dot string. So yeah, I don't know. It's a little bit interesting, but we can't talk about it too much because there's a lot of context missing, and yeah, just don't want to go too deep into it.
And you can
But yeah,
join us on tomorrow's episode to talk more about the binary level exploits.
yeah. Overall, though, interesting post and interesting bug. Even though, unfortunately, like practically, it's probably not going to be applicable in a lot of cases. But that doesn't
It's
mean
a great
it's not a cool
find.
bug. yeah, you're going into like the engine level of PHP and abusing a bug in the filtering itself. So that's pretty cool. All right. So unless you have any last minute notes, we'll go ahead and wrap up the show.
No shoutouts today.
All right. So that's
Actually,
everything
you
we
know
have.
what? I
Oh,
wasn't
okay.
going to
We
make
can
this a
compare the
shout
not.
out. But I actually do have something I'm going to pull up here. Sorry, like I said, I wasn't planning to make this, so I need to grab the link quickly. I saw a tweet recently. It's a older tweet. It's actually from like 2017. No idea how I didn't see it before, but I get the question every so often regarding like, one, finding a mentor, or people just asking me like to mentor them or whatever. And this is basically step by step on how to find a mentor. One, don't ask them to be a mentor, just ask specific questions, apply the insight, and follow up and repeat. Oh, honestly, like that is probably the best approach. Like I tell anybody that asks me about that, like I'm not going to commit to mentoring you, but feel free to ask me questions, and I'm more than willing to answer them. And if you follow up, you do build that relationship with somebody, and you do kind of have that mentorship thing going on. Maybe it's not formally a mentorship, but very much, this post I think captures the essence of what it probably looks like for most people rather than just like asking for a mentor. So I want to at least shout that out as like, if you're looking, you're getting started, consider this. Just asking really good, smart questions that show you're learning. You're a lot more likely, I think, to get interaction from whoever you're asking if it's a good question versus just like mentor me and then where do we go from there? So yeah, I just wanted to shout that out. It's a good post.
I'll add on to that a little bit. Branching off of that specific questions in parentheses that are in the tweet here, because I see a lot of questions where it's like, can you help me hack this target, or can you help me find bugs in this target or something? And it's just a very like loaded question where it's like there's no you can't answer it in a couple of minutes. You're going to need a lot of context. If you're not looking at the target or haven't been actively looking at the target, it's going to require a lot of time investment to get that background knowledge, and that's just not really a reasonable question to ask. But unfortunately, I see it a lot. You just have you have to boil down questions to like a something that can be answered in like a couple of minutes, because you can't really expect some random person that you have no rapport with to just invest like a bunch of time to try to answer your vague question where they have to work to get to the actual question you want to ask, basically. Like that's just it's something that's more common than it should be, but
Yeah, I mean,
I did
learning
want
to
to
ask good
focus in a little bit on
questions.
that specific questions part, because that is kind of the make or break in a lot of cases.
For sure. Like that is like having the questions that somebody can answer without needing to invest a lot of their time. So that might mean breaking down some of the details or abstracting some of the details out about what you're actually working on and just being I know we're saying about being specific, but being a little bit generic. Like you don't need to ask them like in this specific application on like, line 527 of this file, it does this, like I've got this pointer access, out of bounds read or something, and it's doing this thing. Like you can make it a little bit more generic so they'll be able to relate to the question, even if they don't know all the details, but being specific enough that they can just answer it rather than needing to do a bunch of research on their own.
Yeah.
It's hard to get it right, but asking good questions, like anybody who's DM'd me, I do try and respond to most DMs, but sometimes I'll take, days or weeks to do so. Um, and I do tend, while I try to respond to DMs that are specific questions I can answer, if it's something asking me like very, anything that's going to require me already be familiar, I do ignore them. And I'm sure I'm not the only person who does that.
Knowing how to ask good questions is just a really good skill to have in general. So yeah. All right. Yeah, it's a good thing to tack on to the end there. But other than that, that's everything that we have for this episode. Thank you to everyone who tuned in. VOD will be up on YouTube and Spotify and other platforms tomorrow. Remember to check out our Discord or follow us on Twitter. Links are on the site or in the chat for that. And we will see you tomorrow at 7 p.m. Eastern, 4 p.m. Pacific for the binary episode where we get into some of the lower level topics. And we'll see you then.